If you heard crying in the freezing woods, would you stop, or would you walk faster? Thomas Reed wasn't looking to save anything that day, he barely wanted to save himself. The mountains had become his escape from a world that no longer made sense. But the sound that reached him through the trees pierced something deep inside. At 62, Thomas carried the weight of a quiet grief that no one around him knew how to touch. His wife of 40 years, Marlene, had died in her sleep from a stroke 8 months earlier. Since then, time had collapsed into a loop of empty rooms and silent breakfasts. The forest was the only place he could breathe without pretending he was okay. He wore Marlene's scarf wrapped tight like she used to do when he'd forget his jacket. It still held her scent, lavender and old paperbacks, and he kept it on even when it was too warm. In his coat pocket, a photo of her smiled out through creased corners and faded ink. Every step he took into the woods felt like walking back through their life together. The trail was narrow, framed by frost-covered ferns and the silence of early winter. He had just passed a rocky outcrop when he heard it. A cry, thin and high. Not human, not wind. It was the kind of sound that didn't belong in a forest, especially not in December. He stopped in place, heart quickening, straining to hear it again. The second cry was louder, like it was fighting its way through the cold. Thomas stepped off the trail, the sound pulling him down a slope lined with wet leaves and broken branches. With every crunch of his boots, the crying grew clearer. Near a fallen tree, half buried in snow and mud, a tiny bear cub lay shaking. Its fur was matted with sleet, its paw twisted unnaturally under its body. The cub was no bigger than a house cat, ribs faintly visible beneath its dark coat. When it looked at him, its eyes didn't show fear, they showed need. Thomas froze, caught between instinct and empathy. He knew the dangers. Where there's a cub, the mother is never far behind. But this one didn't look hidden or protected. It looked forgotten, abandoned. The cub whimpered again, and the sound cut into him like ice water down the spine. He took a slow step forward, then another, crouching carefully as if approaching a fragile piece of glass. His hand extended without thinking, as if his body remembered how to comfort something small and scared. The cub didn't flinch, it only cried again, weaker this time. A memory overtook him without warning. His daughter, barely 2 pounds at birth, hooked up to tubes in a hospital incubator. That same soft, broken sound of something too young to be alone. He had felt helpless then, but also full of fight. That feeling returned now, hot and sharp. Just as his fingers neared the cub's fur, a deep guttural sound rolled through the trees behind him. It was low, deliberate, and far too close. Thomas froze, eyes wide, breath caught. Somewhere in the shadows, something massive had just stepped forward. Thomas didn't dare move. Every instinct screamed for him to stand up slowly and back away. But something deeper, older rooted him to the ground beside the cub. He turned his head, scanning the trees, waiting for the mother bear to charge. But the forest stayed still. No crashing branches, no grunts, no sound of heavy paws approaching. Only wind brushing the treetops and that tiny, trembling whimper at his feet. If the mother had been near, she was gone now. He looked back at the cub, and this time he saw more than just injury. Its breathing was shallow, its body limp from cold. A pink cut stretched across its snout, dried blood crusted at the edges. This wasn't a recent abandonment. This little one had been alone for a while. Thomas's throat tightened, and his gloved hands began to shake. He'd never rescued anything before, not an animal, not even himself. But something in that cub's brokenness mirrored his own. And just maybe saving it could help him remember what saving felt like. He unzipped his coat without thinking and slipped the cub inside, pressing it to his chest. The warmth of the tiny body against his heart sent a jolt through him, like a forgotten engine sparking back to life. The cub made a soft sound, more breath than cry, and went still. For a moment, Thomas just held him there and cried. As he climbed back up the slope, branches tore at his coat and snow stung his cheeks. He didn't care. Every step was a vow. You're not dying out here. Not today. His knees ached and his breath came ragged, but he didn't stop. Reaching the trail again, he turned toward the parking lot 2 miles away. His phone had no signal, and the forest around him felt endless. If something happened to him, no one would know for hours. But the thought of leaving the cub behind hurt more than the fear of falling. About halfway down, the cub stirred inside his coat, letting out a weak, muffled cry. Thomas stopped walking, leaned against the pine tree, and whispered, "You're okay. I've got you." The words surprised him. They were the same ones Marlene used to say when he came home from bad days. He hadn't spoken them out loud in months. At the bottom of the trail, his truck waited like a lifeline. He laid the cub on the passenger seat, wrapped in an old flannel blanket he kept behind the seat. Its breathing was faint but steady. Thomas drove with one hand on the wheel, the other resting gently on the cub's back. As he turned onto the road out of the woods, a decision settled in his chest like gravity. He couldn't take it to a shelter. Not yet. Not like this. He would bring it home first, at least for tonight. He couldn't walk away anymore. Thomas placed the cub gently on a pile of towels inside a cardboard box in his garage. The space was cold but sheltered, and he set up a small heater nearby. He spooned out some wet dog food, unsure if it was safe, but it was all he had. The cub sniffed it weakly, then took a bite. He stayed awake most of the night, dozing in a chair beside the box, listening to every sound. Around 3 a.m., the cub whimpered, and Thomas instinctively reached in to soothe it. Its tiny head nudged against his hand, seeking warmth. That small gesture shattered something inside him and healed something else. By morning, Thomas had made calls to wildlife centers, but most were hours away or closed for the weekend. A local vet agreed to look at the cub discreetly, no questions asked. Thomas wrapped the animal in Marlene's scarf for the ride. It felt right like she would have done the same. The vet, a kind woman in her 40s, named Dr. Harris, examined the cub with practiced care. He's severely underweight and that leg might not heal fully, she said, her voice low. But he's a fighter. He wants to live. Thomas felt something stir inside him for the first time in months' hope. She gave him medication and feeding instructions, warning that it would take patience and luck. Most people wouldn't bother with a wild animal like this, she said, almost testing him. Thomas looked down at the cub, now asleep in a blanket-lined crate. He's not just an animal, he answered. He's company. Days turned into a week and the cub whom Thomas named Scout began to move more. His appetite grew. He'd lift his head when Thomas entered the room and let out tiny gruff sounds that almost resembled a greeting. Thomas, in turn, began to speak more to Scout, to himself, to Marlene's photo on the fridge. Word of the bear cub eventually spread, despite Thomas's efforts to keep it quiet. A neighbor spotted Scout through the garage window and posted a photo online. Within a day, someone from the Department of Wildlife called, asking questions. Thomas braced himself for a fight he wasn't ready to lose. But when the officer arrived and saw Scout curled against Thomas's boots, something shifted. "You've done more for him than most people would," he said quietly. He explained that Scout would eventually need to be relocated, but he saw no reason to rush. "Just keep doing what you're doing," he added with a smile. That night, Thomas sat in the garage with a book in one hand and Scout sleeping against his side. Snow fell outside, soft and soundless, covering the world in white. For the first time in months, Thomas didn't feel alone. He felt needed. The next morning, Scout stood on all fours, wobbly, unsteady, but standing. Thomas watched, breath caught, as the cub took 2 slow steps across the garage floor. A laugh burst from his throat, raw and surprised. "Look at you," he whispered. "You're doing it." Winter melted slowly into spring, and with it, something inside Thomas began to thaw too. Scout, once silent and skeletal, now greeted each morning with a soft growl and a clumsy hop. Thomas set up a small fenced area in the backyard where Scout could explore safely. Every afternoon, they sat outside together, soaking in the quiet. The garage had become a sanctuary, not just for Scout, but for Thomas's heart. He added a rug, a space heater, even a rocking chair. It was no longer a place of storage, but a place of healing. And in that healing, routines emerged. Thomas woke with purpose, again mixing formula, checking Scout's leg, brushing out his thickening fur. He began walking the trails again, sometimes carrying Scout in a sling across his chest. Neighbors who once avoided his silence now stopped to wave, curious and smiling. The man who once grieved in shadows was stepping back into the world. Scout grew stronger, but so did the bond between them. When Thomas sat, Scout curled up beside him, resting a paw across his boot. When he spoke, Scout looked at him like he understood every word, and maybe, in a way, he did. Eventually, the Department of Wildlife called again, this time with a plan. A protected wildlife reserve in North Carolina had agreed to take Scout, where he'd have open land, medical care, and other rescued bears. The news hit Thomas like a quiet ache. He knew it was right, but it still hurt. The morning of the transfer, Thomas sat beside Scout for hours, memorizing every patch of fur and every little sound he made. He placed Marlene's scarf in the crate. For comfort, he told the ranger. When they loaded Scout into the truck, Thomas whispered, "You did more for me than you'll ever know." Then the door closed gently. The house was quiet that night, but it wasn't empty. Thomas poured 2 cups of tea, placing one at the table's empty seat like he always used to. The sadness was still there, but now it lived beside something softer, gratitude. Weeks passed, then months, and letters arrived from the reserve, updates, photos, small signs of Scout's progress. One photo showed him climbing a tree, eyes bright, body strong. Thomas framed it and placed it beside Marlene's picture. They looked good together. People in town started asking Thomas to speak at the local nature center to tell the story of the bear cub he saved. He always said no, but one day he said yes. And when he stood before the crowd holding up Scout's photo, he simply said, "I didn't just save a bear cub. He saved me right back."